So you've spoken about consistency, you've spoken about discipline, you've spoken about camaraderie, you've spoken about practicing before, let's call it the theater of war. In your experience, when you're in that battle, when you're in, let's say, for example, in the Middle East, and you see things not going well, not going according to plan, what does that teach you about leadership?
Yeah, good. Again, good question. So, look, I think I would be lucky to say that I've experienced good and bad leadership in my time. And including during my time in the Middle East. There were some incredible successes, but also some interesting failures. I think when I look at the failures and one that I often kind of talk about that I kind of got some exposure to prior was there's an activity taken as a bunch of US forces were kind of getting closer to Baghdad. But Saddam Hussein had moved some of his Republican Guard divisions kind of to the south of Baghdad. And one night, the US Army decided to undertake an operation that had over, probably just over 30 Apache, helicopters. And before that operation happened, a bunch of us thought this is just doomed. We knew that it was kind of doomed to failure, but there was definitely a kind of push from the more kind of senior leadership to kind of no, it's going to kind of happen. Guess what? Didn't go so well. Nearly all of those helicopters were kind of shot up. One of them was shot down. The 2 aircrew got captured and were prisoners of war and paraded on Iraqi TV. Nearly all the helicopters were, then because they were so damaged, were unavailable for subsequent operations. It then, really kind of shifted then what the offensive kind of firepower that was available to deal with, some of these Republican Guard divisions, which then ultimately fell on a lot of the US Air Force to kind of deal with and things like that. But what the lesson out of that was, for me, that was foreseeable before it kind of happened. And I think, that was also a little bit of, differences between the services. The US Air Force the Air Forces, Allied Air Forces more broadly had learnt a lot of lessons, all the way from kind of, Korea, Vietnam, and then even in the first Gulf War around, not doing things at low level, moving things to higher altitudes to deal with a range of those different kind of surface to air threats, whether it be anti-aircraft artillery, some of those shorter range surface to air missiles and things like that. Just no longer doing that kind of activity at low level because it was just too high risk and you were pretty much kind of guaranteed to get shot. And yet, despite all of those lessons, despite a whole lot of kind of shift in, tactics, techniques and procedures around you operating in that kind of environment, this activity, kind of went ahead and no surprises in terms of the results. And so for me, that was, from a leadership point of view, your first responsibility is kind of taking care of your troops. It just kind of flew in the face of that. But more broadly, it was reflective, I think, of, amongst some of those decision makers that pressed ahead with that, they hadn't kind of, adapted. They hadn't kind of been taking on a bunch of those lessons learned. There hadn't been enough of that learning that I was kind of talking about earlier, that was then shaping and shifting how they kind of conducted operations. And perhaps you could argue, a degree of arrogance around, well, no, we kind of know best, this will kind of work, despite perhaps, a bigger kind of broader knowledge that maybe that's not really the way we need to kind of shift. So I think, the lesson for me out of that from a leadership point of view is, the world moves on, the world shifts, what worked yesterday may not work today. And you have to kind of be very, very careful about making sure that just because something that you did or applied has worked previously in the past doesn't mean that it's going to work now. And we always kind of say in the military, like, the enemy gets a say, right? So, we might have come up with the best plan, but the adversary's got their own plan as well, right? And, you don't know what they do or don't know about how you're going to operate or what have you. And so you can't kind of just operate in isolation thinking that, well, we kind of know best and we're just going to go and do this. The adversary has an input into that of which you don't necessarily have full control over. And so, it really, some of those kind of failures, I guess, in the Middle East that I kind of got to see was, around that inability of some leaders to evolve or accept that what had kind of worked in the past may not work now, but also just sometimes you just can't be so kind of belligerent that I'm just going to kind of press on no matter what. So I kind of earlier was talking about kind of grit and perseverance and the need to just kind of press on despite objectives, but you still need the ability to kind of sit back objectively and say, is this actually still the right strategy or the right tactic to kind of do that? So, you need kind of grit and perseverance to kind of just keep pushing up against a bunch of those challenges. But you also need the ability to kind of objectively sit back and say, am I actually trying to push up against this the right way? Do I need to go around this, in a slightly different way? So you need that grit and determination and that perseverance to kind of keep pushing, but you also need the ability to sit back and say, am I actually pushing in the right way? Like, do I need to approach this in a different way? So yes, I need to kind of keep pushing, but is that still valid? Is it still a valid approach? Do I need to try a different way? And you owe it to those people, especially, in those cases, when people are getting shot, a lot of dollars worth of military equipment, of taxpayer dollars kind of being destroyed, just on something that, for a lot of people was quite foreseeable. But equally, I think that is a lesson in itself too sometimes, is that, when you're really, really close to a problem, sometimes it isn't foreseeable to you because, you haven't had that chance to kind of step back. You're very, very close to the problem. Maybe you're not taking enough advice from others, or you're not seeing enough different perspectives. So I think it's very, very important, I think, as a leader, to try and take the time to kind of sit back. And we would talk about, in the military, big hands, little map, like look at the big kind of picture, sit back in that big leather armchair and kind of look at the map and just take time. Whereas what I see, and I think it's pervaded the military even now, is just, you see a bunch of senior leaders whose diary is just effectively kind of full. It's like they're going from one meeting to the next meeting, to the next meeting, to the next meeting. And you look at their calendar for the week and they have no free space. They have no time to just sit back kind of almost without interruption, or just have that kind of chance to just look at the big map and go, what are the kind of big problems? I mean, I always joke with my wife, I do my best thinking in the shower, I solve all my problems, or all the world's problems, kind of in the shower. I think it's in part because, I'm not being interrupted. I'm kind of I'm in an environment that doesn't kind of have any interruptions. I've just got water flowing over me, so I'm probably kind of nice and relaxed, and my brain's just got a chance uninterrupted to kind of do that. I don't think that a lot of senior leaders are allowing themselves the time to sit back so that their brain can kind of, process some of what they need to process. Steve Jobs and some of those other kind of guys out of Silicon Valley used to talk about, he would wear the same t-shirt kind of every day because he's like, that's one less decision that I have to make. And, now I think there's a whole lot of body of work coming out talking about, kind of decision fatigue. By 7 o'clock in the morning, if you've picked up your phone, you've maybe scrolled social media or what have you, your brain has to make a decision on every single post it sees. Am I going to stop? Am I going to keep scrolling? Am I going to read that? There's, 7 decisions just on all of that. The more that we can just free our minds of, again, why we should just get off social media, a separate conversation. The more we can free our minds of some of those distractions, the same in a meeting sense, remove some of those meetings and just give ourselves some, what I would call kind of strategic space to sit back and make sure that we're actually kind of just taking it all in without having to feel like I have to kind of make a decision every kind of 3 seconds. So I think there's definitely, and there's, plenty of psychological research around that says, moving yourself to a different environment, getting away from some of those distractions allows you some of that kind of free thinking space. So I think in a military environment, especially in the conduct of warfare, some of those senior leaders can just be so, it's such a fast-paced kind of environment. You think you're kind of having to make decisions the whole time, but as a result, you can get so close to the problem that you do kind of lose some of that objectivity, or you have stopped taking input from a range of different sources that maybe you just kind of actually need to slow down and listen to, and maybe you don't. Sure, the decision ultimately rests on you, and I think a lot of leaders can feel like I've just got to kind of make a snap decision or I have to do it, versus sitting back and going, you know what, maybe I just need another 5 minutes or a couple of extra perspectives to think about this. And that's okay, because I think, there can be a tendency by a lot of, people in leadership positions to think that they have to be seen to have the answers, because, I can't let the troops see that I don't know the answer right now. And there's some issues around that too, but you don't want to be seen as kind of a dithering leader that no one can kind of trust and that can't actually make decisions when you need to. But equally, I think you need to show your people that, hey, I am open to feedback. I am open to trying to, get other ideas and perspectives. And so I think it's a balance, right? Like most things in life, everything is a balance, but you've got to make sure you don't kind of get too skewed towards, ignoring some of those other kind of perspectives. And that might just be as simple as, right, I'm blocking out my diary. I'm just going for a walk, here in Canberra, right? I'm just going to go for a walk around the lake, and I think that's okay. Whereas I think, there's this expectation that, well, if I'm not in a meeting kind of, and going from one to the next and making decisions, actually you do need a bit of free space.